Good morning, afternoon, evening, whenever you're watching this. So, we're heading into the interwar period between World War I and World War II, and there's a lot of big, heavy stuff to talk about. So, we're going to start in Russia. And as you know from the last unit, in 1917, Russia dropped out of the war because the country had an internal revolution and was completely consumed by that. So, today we're going to look at the first part of section 1 of your textbook, Revolutions in Russia. It's a long section, it's got a lot in it, so I'm splitting it into 2 parts. Tomorrow we'll finish up this section, and you'll have your guided reading study guide to do tomorrow. So, what's going on in Russia? Well, before World War I, they had an ancient system of government where they were led by czars. Really, it just means, there's the bell, get to class. It means king, okay? It's the Russian word actually for Caesar. So the Russian kings are known as czars, and it's C-Z-A-R-S, or you'll also see it as T-S-A-R-S because the Russians use a different alphabet than we do. So there's multiple spellings for different things. You can do it either way you want. So in the mid-1800s, Russia realized it was way behind Western Europe and the U.S. There's one of the things to keep in mind about Russia. In addition to being extremely big and extremely cold in the winter, they're about 50 to 100 years behind what's happening in the rest of Europe. And from time to time, they really want to catch up. And so Alexander II, in the middle of the 1800s, wanted to catch up. And he did a bunch of reforms to try to modernize Russia, stuff you don't have to be concerned about. But he freed the serfs and tried to modernize the economy. And in return, he was killed by a group of terrorists called the People's Will. And they blew his legs off, and he died. And so his son, Alexander III, becomes czar, and he ends the reforms. He's pretty angry that his father had tried to make things better, and they murdered him for it. So he said, all right, I'm going to crack down again. And so he returns to what we call autocratic rule. Okay, that means one ruler, and you're not involved in it, right? Just like an automatic transmission, you don't shift the car. An autocratic rule, you have nothing to do with the ruling. All opposition is suppressed, and then dissent, you might not know that word, it really just means disagreement, okay? And that's going to continue after Alexander III dies, but it's characterized by the newspapers are censored, you can't print certain things. There's a secret police called the Okhrana, whose job it is to hassle you if you are known to be an enemy of the regime. Teachers like me and students like you would be monitored in school for not saying anything against the Tsar or against Russia. And Russians, they had a program called Official Nationality, where basically they wanted everyone living in the Russian Empire. And keep in mind, there are dozens of different ethnic groups living in Russia that aren't technically Russian. And that's still an issue today for modern Russia. But essentially, the Tsar said, everybody act Russian. It's illegal not to speak Russian. You can't observe your own holidays, etc. So he suppresses all the minorities, and particularly the Jews. There are a large number of Jews, especially in Western Russia, in the grain belt of Russia, where they are mostly farmers, and they are become the target of official violence that the government does called pogroms to get them to leave, to get them to move so they can have their land. If you saw our high school production of Fiddler on the Roof, or if you've seen the film, that is a little Jewish village, which is called a shtetl, Anatevka, right? And the ending of that musical is when the people of Anatevka all have to leave because the Tsar has ordered that their village be burned down and given to non-Jews. So that's a pogrom. So that happens under Alexander III and will continue under his son, Nicholas II. All right, Nicholas II, as you see from the picture here, very young, when he becomes Tsar, didn't want to be Tsar, but he didn't have a choice because he was the oldest son of Alexander III, so he becomes the Tsar. He's not a natural leader, not really charismatic, just not really cut out for the times that are going to come up as we go into the 20th century, and he's not going to survive long into it. So there he is. There's another look at the first page of notes. Pause here if you are not quite done writing stuff down. And let's make the bonus word for this page pogrom. It's in green. Just circle it, underline it, pogrom. All right. Well, one thing the Tsars wanted to do was to make Russia industrially powerful. And so they're going to lead a series of top down movements to try and make Russia more industrialized like the West. Remember how long ago we studied the Industrial Revolution last semester? Well, Russia still hasn't had it yet. So they want to industrialize. And they want to do it quickly because they're behind. So between 1863, which is still Alexander II, and 1900, they double the number of factories, but they're still behind. But they're making progress. One of the key things we learned last semester to industrialize and have cool machinery and factories and vehicles, you've got to have a lot of steel. Right? And so Russia boosts their steel production. In fact, they double it, and they begin to make those cool modern industrial things like railroads and modern steam engines and things like that. And so they begin major railway construction. Right? Now, we saw Great Britain have railways in the beginning of the 1800s. It's going to be harder for Russia. They're going to, in fact, create the longest railway in the world, the Trans-Siberian Railway, which goes all the way across Russia from St. Petersburg, which is very much the most European Russian city, all the way across the steppes, across Siberia, and into Vladivostok, which is in Asian Russia. Okay, as you can see, very close to Japan. Okay, and look. Keep in mind, look at the size of Japan. Okay, look at the size of Russia. Keep that in mind as we go forward. Anyway, at this point, Russia is beginning to industrialize and modernize. But of course, again, we're going back into what we saw in Europe last semester. Industrialization brings a lot of workers into a lot of cities, but like in the early Industrial Revolution in Britain and Germany, the working conditions are bad, the workers are unhappy, and so in the cities we get these concentrations of disgruntled workers who want things to change. Okay, and so they have workers' rallies. This is a picture of a workers' rally. As you can see, hats were very popular. So this is a group of Russian workers who want some kind of change. And the guy we talked about last semester, Karl Marx, he's going to become popular. Now, only popular with literate people, people who are able to read, which is still a minority of people in Russia. The vast masses of the people are on the edge of starvation and have to work 12, 14 hours a day. They don't have time to read books. But those who do are very taken with Karl Marx and his idea that we talked about last semester, that we have this whole class of workers now called proletarians. They don't have any skills. They don't own their own tools. All they have to offer is their raw physical labor, so they get terrible wages and are treated badly. Well, a Russian group of Marxists, and there's more than one, but the dominant group that's going to win out in the end is a group called the Bolsheviks, which is a fun word to say. Go ahead and say it to yourself, Bolshevik. And they essentially say the way to make a revolution, you can't get a bunch of people to agree and have a big, broad appeal. You got to have a small, hardcore group of revolutionaries who will do anything to bring the revolution about. And so they also, since they're a really small group, they won't compromise with anybody. They destroy any political coalition that they're made a part of. And it's going to be successful. And their leader is this guy, Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, better known as Lenin. And he is, you're going to hear a lot more about him tomorrow. But he's the leader of the Bolsheviks, the successful Russian communists who are eventually going to take over. And there's a picture of him. He's not a very easygoing guy. Not a lot of jokes, not a lot of comedy with Lenin. He's dedicated completely to his cause. And so we'll talk more about him tomorrow. But he is a really good speaker, thinker, writer, and organizer. And he's going to be one of the guys who masters these simple slogans that we've talked about. We'll talk about that more tomorrow. So, other things causing unhappiness among the general Russian person. In the right around 1905, Russia's having internal troubles, like we talked about. They are the peasants are starving, the workers are unhappy in bad conditions, and so the Tsar hopes that he can unify the nation by going to war. And in this case, by going to war against, and remember I showed you the size, against tiny little Japan. Japan and Russia get into a war over a far-flung Chinese territory called Manchuria. They both want to take it over and take it from China, because China's not really ruling it effectively. And so Russia gets into a war with Japan. Now, Japan has become a very modern industrialized country. It's the most modern industrialized country in Asia, and it wants to dominate Asia. So it wants to get rid of both Russia and eventually the United States in the Pacific. Russia is not ready. Russia is not modernized, and they don't know how capable the Japanese are, and they lose the war to the Japanese, and they lose it badly and quickly, which creates a real crisis of confidence in Russia. Okay, they lost, first of all, to this place that's tiny, and remember the racial views of the time. The Russian Empire lost to people who aren't white Europeans. They lost a war to Asians, and they lost it badly. Okay? So there is unrest in Russia. People are wanting change, but at this time, by 1905, most people still support the Tsar. They still think that he is their natural leader, and a lot of people think that he's just not getting the right information. If his ministers told him what was really going on, that the Tsar would change things because he loves his people. So in January 1905, a bunch of people led by Russian Orthodox priests lead a march to the Tsar's Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. And this is a pro-Tsar crowd. They have posters of the Tsar, We Love the Tsar, I Heart Tsar t-shirts, all of that. And they want reforms. But essentially, they're not, the notes here say demanding, but essentially they just want the Tsar to know that they're not happy and for him to take care of it. Well, unfortunately, the Tsar is not there because it's really freaking cold in St. Petersburg in January. He's down on the Black Sea in one of their summer palaces. And so the Tsar's not there, so he doesn't come out. But his Imperial Guard is still there. And here you see a low-res photograph. But here, this is the actual photograph of, this is the Imperial Guard between the protesters. So you can tell these are the guard here. Here's the first wave of protesters here walking up to the palace. And their job is to protect the Tsar and the palace. And the crowd is standing there, and the Imperial Guard is standing there. And we get one of these standoffs where the Imperial Guard says, okay, disperse, this is an unlawful rally, and the people don't leave. And this is when it gets tense. What's going to happen next? Well, in this case, somebody starts shooting, and the army gets orders to fire into the crowd, and hundreds of people are killed instantly. And there's a artist rendition of it, and you get all these images of red blood on white snow, and peaceful protesters being shot down by the Tsar's men. And this makes things, of course, worse. And we get a national movement against the Tsar. It's called the Revolution of 1905, and it takes the form of what we now call a general strike. Right? It's not like the French Revolution where people start breaking windows and burning things and storming Bastilles and chopping off heads. Essentially, everybody goes on strike. School teachers, railway conductors, postmen, industrial workers, everyone stops working, and they bring the nation to a halt. Okay, they're able to coordinate and stop everything in its tracks. And so the Tsar has to do something to end this general strike. So he makes some promises. He issues a thing called the October Manifesto, which you don't have to know about. But it's a list of promises. And he promises that he'll have a parliament, like those cool Western countries like Britain, that can make laws. He promises to guarantee your personal rights and your political freedoms. And that is enough for the people to end the strike and begin working for what they hope is a more democratic Russia. So the Russian parliament is called the Duma, but as you'll see, it doesn't do much. See what I did there? So that's Russia's first parliament. It meets in 1906. It doesn't really have the power to create its own laws, and it doesn't have the power to veto any laws the Tsar makes. So it's basically just a big debating society. And even so, when they begin to publicly disagree with the Tsar, he dissolves them. I mean, he doesn't drop them in acid. Basically, dissolves means he tells them all, go home, your meeting is over. And he dissolves them after 10 weeks. Okay, so, and your personal liberties, etc., yeah, you have them, but he doesn't get rid of his secret police, the Okhrana, that harass you for trying to use your personal rights. So nothing really changes, and people continue to be unhappy, and they're about to get even more unhappy. Okay? Because once again, Russia thinks a great answer to get everybody on the same page, to get us all, yay Russia, all supporting the empire and the Tsar, is to go to war again. Worked out the first time, right? So this is where we pick up the chain of events that we just left in the last unit. As you know, Russia enters World War I. As you know, they are not very modernized. As you know, they're fighting the most modern army in the world in Germany, and they are not going to do well. Right? Again, remember the tactic that they will just throw waves of human beings at German guns and hopefully they'll have more people than the Germans have bullets. That does not give people confidence in their army, and neither does the Tsar. Now here's a picture. Here's the Tsar, and here's Grand Duke Nikolai. Now you might want to follow this guy into battle, but this rather small, quiet man doesn't inspire a lot of confidence or nationalistic feelings. To make things worse, he goes to the front himself to command the armies, and he leaves his wife Alexandra in charge of the government back in St. Petersburg. Okay, so the Tsar goes there. That's bad for a couple of reasons. One, he is personally there now, so people can blame him personally for the failures of the Russian army. Okay, if he hadn't gone there, people could blame the generals. But now the Tsar's there personally. He knows what's going on, and huge numbers of Russians continue to die. So he takes personal blame for that. Also bad is he left his wife, the Tsarina, in charge of the national government. Now, we've talked last semester about how these royals are. They marry other royals from their extended family, often from other countries. And so Nicholas's wife, Alexandra, is actually a German princess. And who are they at war with? Germany. So the Tsar has gone to the front to watch the German army get slaughtered, and he's left his German wife in charge of Russia. So the popularity is plummeting. To make it even worse, this strange character named Rasputin, who you're about to learn a lot about, he shows up, wanders in out of Siberia, and he tells the Tsarina that he can heal her son, who has a disease called hemophilia, which you'll learn about in the video. But essentially, your blood can't clot, and even small wounds can be life-threatening because you don't stop bleeding. And so the Tsarina has been convinced that this guy, the guy in the middle there, so here's the Tsarina, here's Rasputin, here's Alexeyev, here's the son, the male heir to the throne that has hemophilia and a cute sailor suit. She thinks only Rasputin can keep her son alive, and she begins to let him decide more and more what things are going to happen. And he's a complete alcoholic lunatic, as you'll see in the video, and things get even worse. To the point where her cousins and the Tsar's cousins, they want his influence on her to end, so they kill him. But he's hard to kill, and that adds to his legend, as you'll see in the video. But eventually they're able to successfully kill him and throw him in the river, and his influence ends, but things don't get any better. Right? The army is getting even worse, and essentially what was happening is you're asking people, it's a total war for the Russians too, and you're saying sacrifice, work for less money, give up your food, give up your luxuries, but you're doing it all for an army that's losing constantly. And so things get worse and worse until finally the soldiers begin to do what the guy Lenin I showed you predicted. He said they're going to vote with their feet. And that means they're just going to walk away from the war because it's going so terribly and they don't respect their leaders. So that's what's going to happen tomorrow. The Russian armies are going to say, we quit fighting the war, and we're going to get a series of revolutions in Russia that will get us to the beginning of the first communist state. So up next is the video. The most evil men in the world, Rasputin. And I'll warn you ahead of time, it's got a lot of sketchy stuff in it. Sex and drugs, no rock and roll because it hadn't been invented yet. But I think you'll find it interesting, if not a little bit scandalous. So see you back here tomorrow or whenever for part 2 of section 1 of chapter 14.